Welcome to lesson 2, where we're going to talk all about gauge. In the last lesson, we looked at the overview section of the pattern and talked about all the information that you can find there. But now let's dig into a particular section of that overview, the bit about gauge and swatching. Now, gauge is really crucial to sweater knitting, especially because it determines the size of your sweater. As I said in the last lesson, gauge is produced through a combination of particular needles, a specific yarn, and you. And as I mentioned before as well, you often need to play around with your needle size and the yarn that you're using to get as close as possible to the gauge specified by the pattern. So in this lesson, let's talk about gauge that's specified in the pattern, how to figure out what that actually means. We'll talk about how to knit a gauge swatch and how to apply the gauge that you're using throughout the pattern to get even more information mathematically about what's going on. Knitting math is pretty amazing, and it allows us to check our progress and check our pattern versus our sizing all along the way as we go. So let's jump in by looking back at the Tresckow pattern. The designers specified a gauge of 21 stitches and 31 rows for every 10 centimeters in stockinette stitch in the round on US 6 or 4mm needles. That's quite a mouthful, and we need to break down what information is actually there. First things first, we know that 10 centimeters is about 4 inches, and that's about the standard size for measuring gauge. Now we measure gauge over 4 inches rather than, say, 1 inch to provide a more accurate measurement of stitches per inch, ultimately. Now in order to check gauge, our actual swatch needs to be larger than 4 inches. Typically a 5x5 or a 6x6 inch swatch would be big enough so that we can measure the gauge in the center of the swatch. Of course, you can always knit a larger swatch, but for this example, we'll stick to a standard swatch so that we can measure a 4-inch bit of it for stitches and rows. Now, an easy way to guesstimate the number of stitches to cast on for your swatch is to simply double the number of stitches called for in the gauge. So I'll be casting on 42 stitches for my swatch, and the reason to cast on double the number of stitches is that then you'll have about 21 stitches in the center of your swatch, and that'll give you a much more accurate measurement of your gauge than, say, measuring your swatch from edge to edge because you only knit 21 stitches. But in the designer's description of the gauge, we've also been given a lot more information about the kind of swatch we're supposed to create. For instance, we know it should be in stocking stitch or stockinette stitch, and that means that on the right side we're just looking at knit stitches. We know that it should be ideally in the round, and we know that the designer was able to achieve gauge on US 6 or 4mm needles. Now many patterns will ask you to work multiple gauge swatches, one in stockinette, another in cable or lace or colorwork. The Tresckow pattern is intended for beginners, so like I said, the sweater is knit in stockinette, and we only need to make the one gauge swatch. As I said, ideally this gauge swatch would be worked in the round, because the rest of the garment is worked in the round. And sometimes if you make a swatch in the flat instead and you're knitting on the right side and purling on the wrong side, you might find that your gauge can differ in terms of your purl stitches perhaps, or your knit stitches because you're working in the flat versus the round. I will say that making a swatch in the round is a pretty fun party trick, and there's lots of YouTube videos out there about how to do it. But if you prefer to just make a swatch in the flat, remember that your swatch may be off by a slight amount, say 1 or 2 stitches, given that your purl stitches might be a little bit looser than your knit stitches. So you're taking a little risk, but sometimes it's worth it for the ease. Once you knit your gauge swatch, you'll want to wash it using the same process that you plan to wash your entire sweater. That way, the swatch will be a pretty accurate representation of what you might be able to expect in the larger garment. Once you've washed your swatch, you can measure it and make adjustments to your needle size, if necessary. For example, let's say you knit up a gauge swatch on size US 6 needles using DK weight yarn, but your gauge comes out to be 22 stitches rather than 21 stitches for every 4 inches. One of the quick solutions would be to go up a needle size, so to use a US 7 or a 4.5mm needle. But if you're new to knitting, you may want to knit an entirely new swatch to test whether the different needle will be the solution. Knitters with a little more experience will often just go up a needle size and assume that we'll probably meet gauge without needing to make another gauge swatch. Now let's say the opposite happens. You knit up a gauge swatch on size US 6 needles using the DK weight yarn, but your gauge comes out to be 20 stitches rather than 21 stitches for every 4 inches. In this case, the quick solution will be to go down a needle size to a US 5 or 3.75 needle to achieve the pattern's gauge. If your gauge is off by more than one stitch, you're probably going to want to re-swatch because you're going to have to adjust your needle size more substantially, perhaps going up or down a couple of sizes. After a bit of time and experience, you may find that you tend to be a tight knitter or a loose knitter. I know I'm a tight knitter, and that can help you guesstimate a good needle size for a particular weight of yarn. This is especially true if you're working on a pattern from a designer that you've worked on before. You may know that your gauge tends to come out a little bit loose or a little tight for their particular patterns. So you can use that information to determine where you want to start with your needles for swatching. Now, if you're at an absolute loss as to which needles to begin with for the pattern that you're using, let's say the designer doesn't specify anything, oftentimes yarn skeins will have the basic information on the band or on the tag that tells you a range of needles that they expect you to use with this particular yarn. So choosing a needle within that range will likely give you a good start toward getting gauge for that yarn and that pattern. Depending on your pattern, the more important swatch number will usually be the number of stitches per inch, which is what we've been focusing on so far. In many contemporary patterns, the number of rows per inch is less important because measurements for the sweater are often given in numbers of inches rather than in numbers of rows. So for example, a designer might say, continue in stockinette until piece measures 7 inches. However, you don't want to disregard row gauge altogether because in some cases your row gauge will make a huge difference. For example, row gauge may matter a lot if you're knitting a yoked top-down cardigan that has a motif embedded in it. In that case, the designer's probably planned for a certain number of rows per inch to reach that division point for the sleeves. And if your row gauge is off, then your yoke might not fit comfortably because the armholes will either be too short or too long when measured from the top to the bottom. Generally speaking, I think it's a good idea to measure your swatch for row gauge and keep it in the back of your mind just in case it's something that you notice as you read through the pattern. One of the really cool things about gauge swatches is that they give you a kind of code or key to the rest of the pattern. And one of the things I like to do is to take my 4-inch 10 centimeter swatch gauge and divide it down so that I know how many stitches should ideally be in 1 inch of fabric. Now that 1 inch is not as accurate as the 4 inches, but I can then use that information to interpret or dissect other parts of the pattern. And that's what I do when I modify my patterns, and something that we'll do in more detail in other classes on modification. In the case of the Tresckow pattern, we have 21 stitches and 31 rows every 10 centimeters or 4 inches. Now if we divide 21 stitches by 4 inches, we get 5.25. That means there's 5¼ stitches for every inch. And yes, that quarter does matter. Once we're armed with this information, it also means that we can double check things like stitch counts throughout a pattern, and we can interact with a schematic if one is available in some really interesting ways. Let's say we wanted to knit a 38-inch bust. We could multiply 38 inches by 5.25 stitches per inch to find out how many stitches we should have for that measurement. And then we can cross-check that information with the pattern's stitch counts, just to see if everything looks okay. Basically, gauge is the gateway to understanding and dissecting patterns, so that you can fit them better to your body and modify them in ways that make sense to you. Many of my modification classes rely on a basic understanding of gauge and the ability to use those numbers to modify the math of a sweater pattern. Now for the purpose of this class, we're going to use our gauge numbers that we've derived in this lesson to allow us to interact better with the schematic and the main body of the pattern in lessons 3 and 4. Now that you know a little bit more about gauge and how it will interact with the rest of the pattern, let's have a look at some pattern schematics. These sweater sketches often accompany contemporary patterns and provide more information about the designer's sizing assumptions. Schematics are basically the application of gauge to the entire garment, so that you can see how the measurements were derived and whether or not those measurements are going to work for your particular body. So I'll see you in lesson 3.